So I've got the rather difficult task of giving you an overview in about 20 to 25 minutes. So hopefully Seb will keep me to time strictly. So basically what I'm trying to do today is to talk about how we might understand or conceptualize this notion of order and how it might link to ideas of stability and security in fragile areas. So I'm going to structure the presentation by briefly going through the existing orthodoxy, the background to how things are perceived nowadays and how that shapes things, and ultimately how that flattens our assumptions about what we're looking for. And this gives us a good context for thinking about why order might be more a useful concept to get over some of this existing flattening, to give us a more detailed conceptualization of what's happening on the ground. Then I'll run through some very basic definitions to give us some tools to work with before delving into much more depth about what order specifically might be. To background that a little by again saying that ultimately there is an existing orthodoxy around order, and that existing orthodoxy around order is based on the work of Hobbes and Max Weber, and that itself is problematic in that those are very Western assumptions about what order should look like, and they have quite narrow analytical frames which constrain our conceptualization of order in quite significant ways. That means that existing approaches or attempts to use the word order, and let's face it, the word order is sprinkled liberally throughout the literatures in these areas, but without any real conceptualization or depth of thinking about what it means. From that, I'll go straight into a discussion about how we might conceptualize order in a wider way, and then a series of slides discussing how order relates to stability and security, before briefly introducing a bit of a framework for understanding order in a different way, and then coming to some conclusions. So the current liberal orthodoxy, which underpins the intervention literature and the approaches to interventions in fragile states, fragile areas, is obviously underpinned by liberalism, and is very much underpinned by this notion of democracy as being a key tool of maintaining order, developing order, and engaging in legitimate forms of governance. Obvious as well, the liberal orthodoxy is underpinned by ideas about how economic reforms, neoliberalism more broadly, can bring about prosperity, and how this notion that prosperity itself is an ordering structure, is an ordering tool, in that there is the assumption that the richer people become, the less likely they are to buy in for violence or forms of disorder. And then, of course, the liberal orthodoxy itself is underpinned by a whole constellation of language and actors which discuss the value of humanitarianism, human rights, and of course this notion of developmentalism across the world. And you can see this very much in the work of people like David Held and Joseph Nye. This orthodoxy is incredibly strong, and it's very difficult to try and break out of it and to think in different ways. The ways in which I think about order have some synergies with the liberal orthodoxy, but do directly challenge it in a number of ways. And I think probably the biggest problem with the liberal orthodoxy is that there is an inherent contradiction, in that there is the assumption if you do these three main things, this somehow by default creates a form of stability. But yet at the same time, what we're also seeing is very significant forms of intervention, the creation and building of states from scratch, all of which are highly disruptive to existing forms of order in society. And that, of course, creates a significant problem, because when order is disrupted, when order is being therefore renegotiated, that can lead to all forms of contestation and can also, of course, significantly contribute to violence. The orthodoxy is also significantly underpinned by this elision between peace, security, and development, or the so-called security-development nexus. And you can see that there is this assumption in a whole range of literature. So if we start with, say, the Stability Assessment Framework of the Klingendahl Institute, published in 2005, this is very much front and center. It's underpinning everything. There is this assumption that you can't have one without the other. Equally, in some of the more critical literature, and Mark Duffield, of course, is one of the most critical authors writing about these issues. He himself believes that the Security Development Nexus is an incredibly powerful tool, but also to some extent buys into the existence of the Security Development Nexus. So a very kind of truly orthodox organization like Klingendahl, but also a very critical scholar like Duffield, are both buying into the Security Development Nexus in various ways. And that itself is a problem because, of course, they neglect this notion of order. Now, Alice will recognize this quote because I've taken it from her book, Policing Post-Conflict Cities, because I think it's such a really good understanding of what a fragile situation looks like. But I think it's good because it gets us beyond the traditional assumptions of fragility and takes us more directly into an understanding of power and power structures, where ultimately the state is a weaker actor, but ultimately is therefore contending with a whole range of other actors to negotiate power structures, and ultimately therefore the balance of power and therefore the ordering structures of society. And I particularly like the middle of the quote where it says, the highly localized determination of political life need not be synonymous with disorder, anarchy and chaos. In fact, it may be the only way to avoid these conditions in certain circumstances. So in other words, there are existing forms of order. There is a macro order of the state, but then there are highly localized forms of order, and those highly localized forms of order can bring about significant forms of stability, as no doubt Alice will be illustrating through the Somalia case. Now we see that this assumption is echoed even in some of the more orthodox literature. So there's this great German project called the State Failure Project, and we can see that this notion of collapsing state authority and this multitude of actors gives us this background against which order is negotiated and renegotiated, particularly at highly localized levels. So there is the awareness of this importance of a spectrum of power and authority relations, and that this is being redefined. But very little of the existing literature then really builds upon this or uses an order prism to conceptualize it. And I think we can go back to some of the more classic works, such as Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies from 1968, in which the third bullet point down there, I think, is one of the most important quotes for me of the entire book. He says, the primary problem of politics is the lag in the development of political institutions behind social and economic change. So in other words, the ordering, the political order of a society is always to some extent at odds with and lagging to some extent the wider social and cultural order of that society and economic order of that society. And this, for Huntington, explains some of the key difficulties that we face in trying to impose an external form of political order on the top of that society, in that we're just not simply understanding the social and cultural order of the society and the way in which it links to political order. And so therefore, what I'm arguing ultimately is that we need a more holistic understanding of order in order to be able to then shape that order or have some influence over it. So a few basic definitions, since we're trying to tease out some of the distinctions between security, fragility, order, etc. So for me, security is really a matter of perception. It's not really something that is truly measurable. It exists only in relation to a measurement against something else. It is quite psychological, and it is very much a series of negatives. It tends to be the absence of something rather than necessarily the presence of something. And I think that's a particularly important conceptualization for teasing out, because ultimately security is reified. We obsess about security, we discuss it endlessly, but we rarely think about it in enough depth to connect it with how it works with order and how order can create forms of security, whereas security doesn't necessarily have to be present in order for forms of order to be present. And because security is such a broad concept, there can be forms of insecurity existing in highly ordered circumstances. Stability is an interesting conceptualization, and I think in particular there's a problem in the way in which stability and order are often used interchangeably. For me, I think order and stability are actually slightly different conceptualizations. I think about stability in a slightly broader context, in that I think stability is really about this longer term patterned, predictable forms of ordered transition. In other words, a stable situation is one where stresses or shocks do not produce large, irreversible changes. Stability is very difficult to measure, but it is not a synonym for order. Order can be much more fluid in various forms, but it can also underpin forms of stability. As we've seen from the orthodoxy, of course, development is very much part of that orthodoxy. And development brings with it a whole raft of ideas and other forms of actor. Particularly this notion of human security is very important. But we also have a number of significant issues with working out what development is and what development looks like. And ultimately, I think the biggest problem is that so much of these forms of intervention, so much of development politics, historically and today, is an attempt to make societies in which we're intervening much more like us. And in doing so, we are, of course, undermining and attempting to reshape order at both a national and a local level. And we're doing so in ways which are unpredictable and which we don't really have the knowledge of the existing order in order to be able to do it successfully. All of this, of course, is underpinned by notions of power. And power as a concept is heavily contested, but we see that power itself is really about these social relationships which permit people to carry out what they would like to do, even against resistance. And power can exist in various different forms, of course. It can be violence, but it can also be the power to set norms and agendas, etc. as well. So we need to broaden things out from pure focus on violence. Moving on to order and starting with a basic definition before I build on this. I think for me, ultimately, order implies an agreement amongst groups of people, whether those groups are small or large, but ultimately on a societal level implies agreement on basic rules. Order itself, I think, emerges from the limitations of violence. Violence has its limits. The more you use violence, the less effective it becomes, because people tend to mobilize more effectively against violence in the longer term. The threat of violence is often far more powerful than the actual use of violence. Violence is a costly tool to employ. And so actually in the longer term, you are far better trying to shape order to fit your needs than you are in trying to violently coerce people into doing what you want them to do. In other words, it's much cheaper to get people to behave themselves because that's the way in which life is lived. It's natural, it's unthinking. So if you can shape that order, you have to use less violence, and it becomes easier to control people, and it becomes cheaper to rule a society. Alice's definition, again from her book Policing Post-Conflict Cities, is, I think, one of the most useful and parsimonious definitions of violence out there. She defines it as a set of predictable behaviours structured by widely known and accepted rules which govern regular human actions and behaviour. So in other words, order is in many ways the water in which fish swim. Order is a social world, and that social world shapes people from the moment in which they're born. That means that order is both immutable, but also at the same time is structural, but it does evolve. Order is an evolving concept, and sometimes that evolution of order can be quite rapid, particularly in a conflict situation. But there are, of course, key elements of existing orders which will survive conflict and which will re-emerge after conflict is over. Now, our existing approaches to understanding order focus very much on Hobbes and Weber. Hobbes's idea that you need a leviathan, a strong state, in order to impose an order through the monopoly on the use of violence. And Weber's notion at the same time of order as being much more of a social structure, a bit less to do purely with the state, but focused very much on ideas such as class, status, and party, to use his language. And those two structures of order, those two understandings of order, have very much shaped in many ways the ways in which we go about interventions since the 1990s in particular. So these explanations of social order tend to be very macro-oriented and much less bottom-up oriented. They're trying to understand the entirety of society. And that's one of the problems I think that you find with them, is that societies themselves are composed of multiple different forms of social order which overlap with each other to create a coherent whole. So rather than studying it from the top down, it makes much more sense to study it from the bottom up in a more localized attempt to understand how order enmeshes with itself. There is fundamentally in sociology what's known as the problem of order and how you create order at a macro level in a state. And ultimately, as Rogers puts it, you see this problem of order arising fundamentally from this perceived contention between the opposing nature of individual desires and collective interests of society. That is a very, very Western way of looking at it in many ways, and that can be quite problematic. Now, in sociology, a number of different authors have tried to balance this problem of order over time. And this is structured in many ways, the ways in which we think about order. I want to argue, partly based on Joel Migdal's work, that we need to understand order in a much broader sense than purely a political form of order. So for Migdal in his State and Society work, he believes that society is this melange of social organization. So groups themselves have social control and they form rules within their individual groups, which they then negotiate with other groups in society. And the state itself tries to seek to have some kind of an ordering structure in shaping these rules between and the negotiations between these different groups in society in many ways. In other words, for Migdal, social control is a form of power, and they wish to shape the power of the state, to give the state more power to intervene and to structure these organizations, ordering practices. This leads, of course, to what's known as the state leader's dilemma. In other words, the state will face multiple other forms of strongmen, other forms of agents of order in society, and therefore have to develop what Migdal calls these strategies of survival that will pull individuals away from these strongmen into the support of the state. So in other words, the state is, in its very nature, seeking to reshape order. But it never really truly has the skills in many fragile countries to do so. And therefore, there is always this constant interaction, reshaping of order, rebalancing of order, of power structures within order in particular, amongst actors of various kinds. This leads to Migdal's core argument of the book, which is outlined on page 9. And he says that the state is a key actor in this ordering process, then that it interacts and at times conflicts with an entire constellation of social forces in these disparate arenas of society in order to build a broader structure of order across that society. Now, again, this is a big step forward from some of the initial literature, but it's still quite problematic, partly because it still reifies the state, and partly also because particular forms of social force in society. It does reify some of those traditional leaders, etc., and it does neglect the broader kind of structural factors and engagements between individuals and the way in which individuals choose to uphold or undermine order on a daily basis. So for me, I think we need to start to understand what this wider order looks like. And we also need to move significantly away from focus on political order as this kind of separate analytical category. I think Migdal does us a real favor in showing us how state and society are so intertwined. And that therefore means that we have to bring in social forms of order, cultural forms of order, in order to actually understand the broad structures of order in society and which aspects of order are more amenable or likely to change than others. So if we combine these different forms of order, we get a much more holistic understanding of what society is looking like, and therefore how we can begin to ourselves both disrupt and uphold forms of order which we find either agreeable or problematic for the goals which we seek. Order, therefore, is a negotiation, and it's negotiated at multiple different levels. What we're seeing in the academic literature now, particularly in that associated with rebel governance, is that there is an increasing location of violence within a broader context of different forms of negotiation, bargaining, and in particular the creation of norms in society. And those norms in society are very crucial to upholding different forms of order. So we see these direct forms of negotiation of the kind that Migdal is thinking about between the state and other significant actors in society, but we're also seeing these indirect forms of negotiation. And this is ultimately, in some ways, the kind of the power of crowds. How do crowds seek to engage with and to change forms of order that they dislike? How do people shape their environment as individuals, as collectivities, but in ways in which are not necessarily directly negotiated, which are much more organic and evolutionary by people changing the pattern of their behavior? I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but there's a significant trend amongst those under the age of 40, in the West in particular, not to have a ringtone on their phone. Their phone is on silent all of the time, whereas people over the age of 40 seem quite happy with their phone ringing. Did someone actually impose that as a law, as a rule upon us? No, it seems to emerge almost organically, and is clearly a form of order amongst those under 40. So this exists, and it is powerful, and it is the thing which is missing, I think, from much of our understandings of order. Now, Sebastian will absolutely recognize this sentence because he came to a talk of mine earlier in the month, and we were discussing my general approach to understanding order. And in an email, he summed it up in a way in which I don't think I ever could. And I spent all of yesterday trying to work out if I could rephrase Seb's sentence. But actually, I think it sums up my broad approach to understanding order. And how we might take order as a framework for actually studying and therefore gaining information about a particular order in place. How would we approach understanding order? So for me, I think this is my broad structure. Clearly, this is a starting point. It is, as Seb also noted in the email, elite-centric and instrumentalist. But I think it's a very powerful tool from which we can then start to go into networks, structures, and norms in society and work out A, how they structure order, B, how that can lead to forms of stability, and C, how therefore we can begin to work out how we can best apply influence to reshape order in our own particular interests towards the goals which we seek to achieve. Through our interventions, and ultimately, to some extent, to ensure that the liberal orthodoxy is not something which is steamrolled into place and causes significant disruption and problems, but which can be applied in a much more nuanced, localized manner to both reinforce order and reshape order in our interests. So for me, therefore, order is much more important than security as a concept. Security is an outcome of order. Security is a tool to help order consolidate. It's a means or a process to getting to forms of order that we would like to see. But you can have forms of order existing in insecure environments, and that is also important to note. It is far more important to note internal politics and societal norms as being key agents in shaping order than international pressure is. And I think ultimately we are much better off understanding order through the routine issues rather than by studying exceptions. We need to understand these patterns, how they evolve and how they change due to external shocks. Order therefore gives us clear tools to understand what is happening and therefore to act in different ways which are much more likely to be effective. But ultimately, order is, to some extent, as Alice notes in her book, open-ended, multi-layered, and difficult to pin down. But for me, I think this problem is diminishing. if we step away purely from order as a theoretical tool and think about it in terms more of a way of thought, a process for helping us to generate knowledge, that then leads to this importance of knowledge, because all of the actors in an ordering environment, in an ordered environment, know things instinctively, but equally themselves are seeking to collect information which they can turn into knowledge about how the ordering structure functions in order to be able to reshape that order in their own interests. So knowledge about order is not just about intelligence gathering, it's about gathering information to convert into knowledge which can help us to understand how the order operates, which can then help us to work out which actions are most likely to be effective in reshaping that order in our interests along various different time horizons. But we also need to be humble and recognize that no one in an ordered environment truly understands how it works, but that everyone is in the same game of trying to generate information which they can turn into knowledge, which then enables them to act to try to reshape order in their own interests. Thank you.